Today it's the fourth and potentially final episode of our series on the quality of various chemicals in the reefing hobby, this time calcium additives. And then give away a Neptune Apex and a dose for outer water changes at the end. Hi, I'm Ryan, your host of BRStv Investigates, a weekly YouTube series which explores popular reefing theories, products, methods, what the manuals are missing with a focus on putting them to the test, and then rate that theory based on our scale of reef fantasy to reef certainty. This week we have episode 4 of maybe a 5-part series which seeks to continue the conversation that's been going on for the last 15 years in asking, are the off-the-shelf ungraded or tech-graded calcium additives just as good as reefing additives? Or better yet, just because it has a picture of a fish or coral in the front, does it really mean that it's any better? In addition to that, answer some of those questions on our new BRS Pharma line of chems, and do pharmaceutical grade materials really mean that it's any better, or at least in a meaningful way where reefers are likely to realize incremental or functional results? Looking at the last 3 episodes, the results have been mixed. While the pharma grade materials have come out on top in 2 cases and near the top in the other, the aquarium labeled products didn't always perform better than the off-the-shelf chems. That's with the exception of the last episode where the industrial grade ice melter magnesiums didn't perform very well at all. This has really been an interesting journey, and I think pretty accurately demonstrates there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer, and in some cases like alkalinity, the differences are largely functional, where most of the common options seem to be relatively pure, and the differences are ease of use related to baking or not baking DIY solutions, concentration of those solutions, and minor impurity improvements, and then just making an informed decision based on what any of the costs or the value is to you. With the Kalkwasser, it certainly seemed like, with the exception of the bulk pharma, all of the other options were nearly identical, and it's probably wise to just pick the cheapest option around. The BRS Pharma, however, showing 0 aluminum rather than in the hundreds, 40 times lower heavy metals, 0 phosphate rather than the 40s, and only 22 silica rather than in the thousands. There was a pretty undeniable quality difference. Outside of that, the Pharma Calc is also a synthetic product which comes in a free-flowing crystalline pattern without that calc poof. So there's some functional performance improvements as well. So at this point, I think there was a bit of something here for everyone. Certainly reaffirmed that many of the DIY reefing community's findings that some of the off-the-shelf chemicals seem to perform at an acceptable level, which is awesome because I think we'd all like it if this hobby was a bit more affordable. However, cheapest isn't the #1 priority above all for everyone. I think we also got a chance to identify some legit expectations for what you get when the priority is identifying the best option, not necessarily the cheapest. Better yet, rather than just saying the word best or even better, which is often just marketing jargon, adding some data so we can all make more informed decisions and know what our dollar is really buying. However, last week was a bit different, and my own personal interpretation was the off-the-shelf industrial magnesiums were just not options that I would personally use or recommend to anyone that's looking to me for data-backed suggestions, largely because they're either mixed up visually filthy, pretty undesirable copper levels, or sky-high lithium levels. Open and honest, when I saw the data on the magnesium, I was pretty darn sure that the magnesium data wouldn't be the most popular thing in the world with some of the DIY reefing community. However, just like the fact that the BRS Pharma came out second best behind Brightwell, the data is what it is, and I just shared it as I saw it. Anyone can use the data how they like. This series is really about pairing personal experiences with data to make more informed decisions on the nutritional supplements that we add to the reef tank. Rather than just saying something is better, cheaper, or seems to be okay, it's a lot easier to make a decision when there's data to define what better really means, and rather than just the word cheaper, is the savings a meaningful amount to you or your tank? There's no right or wrong here, just different shades of value. So this week we're testing calcium additives. Behind the scenes, calcium additives are much easier to obtain in suitable quality than magnesium, but not quite as easy as alkalinity, so I'd anticipate seeing that in the results here. We're testing 6 chemicals again. BRS Pharma, one of the more popular aquarium options we labeled Aquarium 1. Brightwell's Reef Code AP, another aquarium bulk option, and then a food grade option with Mrs. Wages, and presumably a tech grade option with the Prestone Driveway Heat Ice Melter. Again, Brightwell stepping up, and regardless of the results, adding transparency to their company and what they offer the reefing community. I know they're already adding the community's feedback to their continual improvement process. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. It's important to note that neither Mrs. Wages or Prestone make any claims to being suitable for a reef tank nutritional supplement, and if asked, I'd wager at least Prestone would tell you distinctly to not use it for this application. But that said, there are a lot of reefers out there that have used various tech grade and food grade chemicals, including myself. For years, I used a 50-pound bag of Dow Flake until they made a change to the formulation and the production process that made it less desirable to me. Simply put, I don't think it's so much about identifying if a tech-grade calcium is acceptable, because I think some almost certainly are. It's just about identifying which ones are suitable, because there's zero chance that they're all the same and any old option will produce the same results. This is an indisputable fact, and based on where the source material comes from, how it's processed, and the facility standards. So this is how we're going to test the materials. I collected the samples from our shelves, ordered a couple that we don't stock here, went to a big box hardware store for the ice melter, and we're going to first take some visual assessments by mixing 172 grams, which is close to a cup of each in a liter of RODI water, then assessing clarity as well as total volume of water and solubles. A visual assessment will only tell you so much, but honestly, if you can see it with the naked eye, it's not a trace element. If it turns muddy brown, rusty red, or has a large amount of insoluble crud at the bottom, I don't really care what the ICP-MS testing says. I'm personally not going to use it on my reef tank. There are too many other affordable and safe options out there to gamble an often multi-$1,000 investment in my reef tank to use something that I can see with the naked eye is dirty. Next, we sent the 6 samples out to NSL Analytical to be tested with ICP-MS testing and other methods for 21 parameters. This is 16 individual parameters and a group of heavy metals reported together. This type of testing should provide a solid window into the suitability for a reefing application. The BRS Farm is a sugar-like, free-flowing crystalline structure. Aquarium 1 and Brightwell are more powder-like, but a bright white material. Once I got the food grade Mrs. Wages out of the container and into a glass jar, I could actually see that it has a pink tint. The larger Prestone driveway pellets also have a pink tint as well. These subtle tints are something that can be somewhat difficult to see or get on camera with ambient room lighting, but in a more controlled environment, it's fairly easy to see with the naked eye. I'll note that many of the chemical manufacturers I've spoken with have suggested that the pink tint is often the result of rusty production equipment or other source of iron oxide in the material. How big of a deal iron is more dependent on what it's coming with the iron source than the iron itself. After mixing all the samples up, there are certainly some visual surprises. The BRS Pharma mixes up crystal clear almost instantly with zero sediment at the bottom. This is the only sample that showed no signs of visual contaminants or precipitation. The Aquarium 1 option, well, the salt itself was white. Once we mixed it up, turned into an obviously brown solution, which eventually did clear up with a sizable amount of mucky sediment that settled out. You can see that the various impurities actually stratified out. Brightwell's Reef Code AP has a pretty large amount of suspended and settled out precipitate. However, it's important to note that Brightwell's Reef Code is a more holistic approach which contains and balances calcium, magnesium, chlorides, and sulfates. The net result of all that is it's appropriate to expect some precipitate. The container should likely be shaken prior to dosing. The Aquarium Bulk 1 option mixed up crystal clear to begin with, but to my surprise, there's actually a layered dark gray-brown sediment that settled out overnight. It's interesting that this was not easy to see when the liquid solution was initially mixed. Both Mrs. Wages and the driveway heat mixed up with a pretty significant brown or red tint. The tint is something that largely did settle out overnight, and there were some obvious red impurities that settled out at the bottom of the cone. This type of red sediment doesn't inherently mean that it's bad for our intended purpose, but if all things remain the same, I'm pretty certain for a reef tank that almost everyone would select an option that mixes up clear and without the undesirable colored sediment. Moving on to the analytical testing, we're going to cover each parameter, highlighting the highest and lowest levels in each case. I'll stop for a quick explanation when appropriate, but the real review will come at the end. I'll put a link to the full report in the video description for anyone who would like to review it. Note there are certified results which largely go as low as 1 part per million, as well as estimates which go into the parts per billion. Because it later gives a closer window into basically the same results, particularly those that read 0 or near. We're going to use these for today's review, but the information is there for anyone to review either. As I go through them, note the colors. Green means they perform the best, red the worst, and yellow meaning they are not the worst, but still high enough to garner consideration. Starting with acid and solubles, where BRS actually had the most with 900, Aquarium Bulk 1 had the least with 0. However, BRS was the best with water insolubles with 0, and the Prestone driveway heat had the highest with 1,500 parts per million. BRS Pharma had the lowest aluminum with 0.2. Both of the retail aquarium options had the highest with 2 parts per million. BRS Pharma had the lowest arsenic with 0.2, and Brightwell had the highest with 0.6. BRS Pharma also had the lowest boron impurity with 0, and Brightwell had the highest with 76. Looking at the calcium alone, BRS actually had the lowest calcium content because we use a dihydrate, where the rest are presumably an anhydrous, meaning it contains less water. Aquarium Bulk 1 had the highest calcium content. BRS Pharma also had the lowest copper content as well with 0.2, and the highest was Aquarium 1 with 0.9. BRS Pharma once again had the lowest iron with 1,000, and the Aquarium Bulk 1, Mrs. Wages, and Prestone all had 1,400. Surprisingly, the food grade Mrs. Wages and driveway heat both actually had the lowest heavy metals with 3. The highest was Aquarium 1 with 192 parts per million. All the samples had 0 mercury, something that was the case with all 4 episodes of this series. Mercury just seems to not be an issue. BRS had the lowest lithium with 0.04, and Brightwell and Prestone had the highest with 160 parts per million. The Mrs. Wages had the lowest magnesium impurity, and Aquarium 1 had the highest with 960 parts per million magnesium. With calcium, the high magnesium impurity is almost always a general sign of a fairly impure source or limited processing or purification steps. I'd note that Brightwell has much higher magnesium, but that's kind of irrelevant because they add magnesium to the mix. All the samples had 0 phosphate. Brightwell had the lowest lead at 0.02, and BRS had the highest at 0.6, which I'd note is still very low. BRS Pharma had the lowest silica with 0, and Aquarium 1 had the highest with 10, Prestone had the lowest tin with 0, and Brightwell had the highest with 0.2. And lastly, BRS Pharma had the lowest zinc with 0, and Mrs. Wages had the highest with 1. So just looking at this with a quick glance, I think it's pretty easy to see that combined with the visual assessment of a crystal clear solution with 0 visual contaminants and the best performance in 11 of the 17 ICP-MS categories, most people would likely agree that BRS Pharma easily came out on top here. However, the BRS product is less concentrated, so we adjusted for that, and the results were the same. BRS Pharma is still the best in 11 out of the 17 categories. This is just a net result of the quality of the source materials, processing steps, and type of facility that's required to produce pharmaceutical-grade raw materials, and really not a huge surprise. So I think the second question is, who came out as the cheapest viable option? Last week I took a bit of heat on Reef to Reef because I ruled out the 2 ice melter options, so I'm not going to make that same mistake this week. All of you can make up your own mind. However, I will share my own thoughts for consideration. First off, I have to reiterate that if you can see it with the naked eye, it isn't a trace element, so there's little chance that I would personally use anything I can visually see as dirty or mixes up brown or red. I wouldn't use a salt mix that mixed up brown or red, so why would I dose something in the tank on a daily basis that does? The savings would have to be overwhelming, but in this case, it's like $1 or $2 a month. Even if it was free, I think many reefers would avoid at least a couple of these options tested today. So in that spirit, I would personally rule out the Aquarium 1, which mixed up brown with a considerable amount of muck at the bottom, the food grade Mrs. Wages, and the Prestone driveway heat, which also mixed up pink with a red sediment, and even the other Aquarium Bulk option mixed clear, but there was a considerable amount of unknown contaminants at the bottom after 24 hours. However, I understand if some reefers are okay with that. We don't know for sure if any of those things are actually bad. I particularly understand if you've been using one of these options with solid results. So ignoring the visual results and only looking at the ICP-MS results, I would still rule out the Aquarium 1 because of the 192 parts per million heavy metals. The savings would have to be significant for me to accept the 160 parts per million lithium that some of the samples had. In the end, because the Aquarium Bulk option actually currently retails for more than the BRS Pharma, I don't think I have a cheaper recommendation on calcium with today's test. I do think that you could find a food grade option in a 50-pound bag, which is probably multiple lifetimes worth, but you could save $1 or $2 a month. Just to be completely clear here, I don't believe for a moment that any of these elevated elements that ICP testing pointed out would be so toxic they would result in coral mortality in a single dose, because these elements are being diluted by incredible magnitude in a reef tank. My main concern is more so what happens over the course of 100 or several hundred doses over the next couple years. This is particularly true when water change schedules are smaller or less frequent than others. Fact is, all of us lose corals over time, and almost none of us know why it happens, but I don't think anyone would assume that it's something that we've been dosing for years. But in reality, water chemistry and buildup of contaminants is an obvious consideration because water chemistry is one of the 4 major components of coral biology and health. Reality is, if poor chemistry related to additive choices resulted in a single $60 coral death, it could take up to 5 years to recoup the savings. I'd like to acknowledge that I fully realize that all of this might just seem like a pitch for BRS Pharma Chems, and financially it's in our best interest to pitch the highest quality available. But I also like to point out that all this testing was over 20 grand to do, and half that money was essentially spent on reaffirming that baking soda is a viable option for alkalinity. And outside of the pharma, basically any food-grade Kalkwasser seems to be identical to most of the aquarium options. On top of that, we also shared our magnesium ended up being second best to another. We're doing our very best here to take a real look at these chems for use in a reef tank, even when it isn't in our best interest in many cases. There's a reason why no supplier has done this before. It's because it's impossible to look perfect on all elements, and who wants to spend a fortune to share their dirty laundry or promote cheaper alternatives? In the end, the results just are what they are. Our interpretation might be different in each case, but there's now more data out there for all of us to apply to our combined knowledge sets and experiences to produce collectively better results with our reef tanks. So I'm going to answer both of today's questions, but today I'm going to answer them based on the results of all 4 tests and our overall take on the matter rather than just calcium. Are off-the-shelf ungraded or tech-graded calcium additives just as good as reefing additives? I'm going to give this one a 5 and somewhat inconclusive. The food-grade options seem to have a reasonable performance for reefing, but not in every case. However, I personally don't see enough value or savings to attempt to use any of the tech-grade options that we tested, based on both visual and ICP assessments. Again, I realize that saying that isn't going to be the most popular statement in the universe for some, particularly those who may have used them for a long period of time. To that, if I was looking to roll the dice and shoot for some savings using tech-grade materials, I would absolutely look to those advanced reefers out there who have had multi-year successes and willing to show the results. If it matches what you want to achieve with your tank, use that exact material that they're using. Anything else is just an unnecessary gamble. In that spirit, I don't think the mindset of sharing any old tech-grade material will work for your reef is very helpful. That kind of blind advice really has the sole goal of saving money that misses what we're really trying to do here, which is a thriving reef in our homes. It's certainly more helpful to hear, I've been using this material for this long and this is the results I've achieved, which is invaluable to the reefing community and has a goal of producing a successful reef tank and potentially saving a couple bucks a month as well. In fact, real results that reefers share are very often more valuable than anything else shared in this hobby, and in some ways including this video. This is a good point to also share my single favorite reefing quote of all time by my friend Greg Carroll. Be wary of the advice coming from those who will not show you the fruits of their success. I don't believe that anyone is intentionally trying to deceive others. It's just everyone's idea of what success looks like is different, and it's helpful to get advice from those that share the same idea of what good looks like and have achieved it. So next up is the second question. Do pharmaceutical grade materials really mean that it's any better, or at least in a meaningful way where reefers are likely to realize incremental or functional results? I'm going to give this a strong 8 out of 10. The Pharma Kalkwasser was dramatically better. The calcium today was certainly better. The alkalinity was somewhat better in both form and function. However, the Brightwell came out on top of the BRS Pharma Magnesium, but in this case, I imagine they're using a similar grade or higher material. Also, I'm going to stop short of saying that you absolutely need this high quality material for your reef, but for those of you that are looking for some of the best options out there, the pharmaceutical grade standards for source material, refinement, and facility standards will produce anticipated quality results, and when purchased in bulk like this, affordable as well. I think this is a good point to actually share all this testing really isn't fair in the end. Even though I'm good friends with many of the retail additive companies out there, behind the scenes, we all admit it just isn't possible for a standard retail product with typical distribution layer markups to compete on all these types of raw materials. It just really is what it is. Really, at this scale, even some of the industrial chemicals are marginally less expensive on a monthly or yearly basis as well. I think anyone in the chemical industry would tell you that pharmaceutical grade materials are obviously better than ungraded tech and in many cases food. However, they also cost so much, it isn't a viable option to sell a retail aquarium product with this high of quality standards. If you did, it'd be prohibitively expensive after they've gone through the 2 to 3 levels of retail distribution markup. Really, the only way that this is possible is buying direct from the global material producers and then offering it direct to reefers without those multiple layers of distribution markup. But in reality, even that wouldn't be possible if reefers weren't buying tens of thousands of pounds of these additives. It's reefers' overwhelming support that allows us to source and buy quality materials like this and make sure that there's a very limited financial impact between using pharmaceutical grade materials on your reef and the cheapest available option. So in the end, all I can really say is thank you to everyone who has supported BRS for the last 10 years and made this possible for the reefing community. This is a solid example of the behind the scenes results when the community and the supply chain work together with the same goals, a solid, easy to maintain reef tank. I mentioned earlier that this might be the last episode, but there might also be a fifth. I'm going to let you all decide if that's the case. I've been following a thread called "Has anyone ever had their SPS die due to dosing spectricide for nitrates?" And the answer is yes. Many have had issues, but in that thread there's a debate if it's potassium, how it's dosed, or a bunch of other things, including if the spectricide stump remover is adequate quality for this application. I gotta say, looking at this objectively, the quality of stump remover as a nutritional supplement for a reef tank would be my first question and not the last. I'm personally interested in finding out more details on the quality and sending it out for ICP-MS testing along with some other samples, but I'm struggling to get the team to commit to the few $1,000 budget because most of them don't think enough reefers are dosing nitrate to care. So if you're interested in seeing this, let us know in the comments or Reef to Reef thread, or even better, that thread specifically, and I'll share the desire with the team and try to get it approved. If not, I'll eat some crow and let them know that I was wrong on this one. Outside of that, in today's Reef to Reef thread, linked below, we're asking everyone in a poll, what type of calcium and alkalinity additives do you use? BRS bulk chems, retail aquarium chems, or do-it-yourself solutions? I can't wait to see the breakdown. Even better, I think everyone would like to see the comments as to why you've selected one solution over another. As always, we're giving away something cool this week. We're going to give away one of those new Neptune ELs and a Neptune dose this week. Why the dose with it? Well, after installing one for an auto water change system, I'm blown away with how easy it is and how much I love not hauling around buckets of water. Something that you're going to hear more about in the future, but why not give that joy away to someone for free this week? So hit that link in the lower left or head on over to the site, click on specials and deals, and then free stuff to sign up. As always, if you like what we're doing here, hit that subscribe button and notification bell to be instantly notified when new reefing content comes out. We release new reefing videos every Wednesday and Friday, so see you next week where I think we'll see an update on either the ULMs or the BRS 160.